Hi folks, and welcome to this revision video for higher geography for your formal assessment block. So just to start off with a little bit of important information, so there will be one paper sat in the first week back after the Christmas holidays. It will be 95 minutes long during the double period, and it will be a total of 85 marks. 45 of these marks will be a combination between the physical and human topics, so that will be atmosphere, biosphere, population and urban. And then you'll have 20 marks for your climate change and 20 marks for your mapping skills. This revision video will focus on 3 topics, one from each area pretty much. So it'll be atmosphere first of all as your physical topic, population as your human topic, and then the mapping skills. Folks, the section in this video will look at some atmosphere revision for higher. So first of all, just a wee run through of the possible questions which could come up. So explaining why there's a surplus of solar energy in the tropical latitudes and a deficit of solar energy towards the poles. Explain how atmospheric circulation cells and the associated trade winds assist in redistributing energy around the world. Describe the pattern of ocean currents for either the Pacific Ocean or Atlantic Ocean, and notice it's the Pacific Ocean that we always do. And then finally explain how these ocean currents redistribute energy around the globe. And then finally is your ITCZ. So there's part A where you can describe the origin and characteristics of both air masses, so the tropical maritime and tropical continental. And then finally describe the change in rainfall patterns as you move inland from, and I've put question marks there because obviously the graphs can vary, but from an inland city to a coastal city, and give reasons for these differences. So if we have a wee look at each one in a little bit more detail. So the first one is our surplus of solar energy at the tropics and a deficit towards the poles. So there's 4 key things you want to mention for this. So first of all, you've got your oblique angle of insolation. So this is the angle that the sun hits the earth at. So the angle is perpendicular at the tropics, so therefore the heat is concentrated over a smaller surface area, so therefore heating is greater, whereas at the poles there's a larger surface area to heat, so it's spread, so then they get less energy from the sun. Then secondly, the distance the atmosphere is to travel through. Now, one of the key things from marking this is that it's all about absorption and reflection. It's not necessarily that there is less atmosphere to pass through or less distance to travel through, but the key thing you need is that the sun's rays have less atmosphere to pass through at the tropics, so less energy is lost through absorption and reflection by the clouds, the gas and the dust. The key thing, like I say there, is the absorption and reflection. The third one, the albedo effect. So obviously your white ice and snow reflecting any heat, any energy that actually gets to the poles. Whereas at the tropics, you've got green, dense, forested areas which will be able to absorb. That's quite a good one because you don't get a reversal. So you can talk about the white reflecting and then the dark green absorbing, and you can actually get 2 marks available for that one. Now the final one in our change in seasons, which some people do tend to find the trickiest, but I think the best way to approach it is just to talk about how the tilt of the axis means that the sun is higher in the sky between the tropics throughout the year. So the tropics receive insolation all year round, whereas in the poles there's no solar insolation at winter, so they get 24 hours of darkness. So that's the kind of key things. It's to do with the tilt of the axis, and then you've got insolation all year round on the tropics, whereas at the poles they will get no insolation and they can have up to 24 hours of darkness. Okay, our second one for our atmospheric circulation cells and redistributing energy around the globe. I find that the easiest way to do this is to learn a diagram, and then providing you learn the diagram, it takes you about 30 seconds to a minute to actually draw it in the exam, and then you can use this to help with your answers. So for example, if I do it with you just now, I would just do my top quarter of the earth and my curvature here, and then I've got my 3 cells. Now you'll notice, as very often, your sketches don't need to be perfect, but they can help you, and like I say, you can do it really quickly. And then what we need to have is our lines of latitude added to our diagrams here. So we've got our 3 cells. So first of all, we've got our Hadley cell, then we've got our ferrule cell, and then we've got our polar cell. So I'll just pop these out into full. Ferrule. Now, one of the lucky things you can do as well is you do get named example kind of marks here. So by recognising you know that the Hadley cell is the one in the south or the one closest to the equator, you get a mark. So even just by doing this diagram, if your written answer is not very great, you'll still get a couple of marks. Okay, I always encourage people to put on your degrees. So that's 0 degrees. Then we've got 30 degrees. Please ignore my writing on the iPad. Then you've got 60 degrees, and then you've got 90 degrees here as well. So these are your lines of latitude. Now, the key thing to make sure you get right is the way the arrows go. Okay, so your first cell is an anti-clockwise cell. I always say to people, think of rising air at the equator. Okay, your ferrule cell is the clockwise one. It's the only one that goes clockwise. So then your polar cell is anti-clockwise again. And again, ignore my drawings on the iPad. They're awful. You're more than welcome to come and I'll do one with you in class. What I also get people to remember or recognise is that we have high pressure, then we have low pressure, then we have, that's nonsense, I'm talking absolute rubbish, and you will see how everybody makes mistakes and we're learning as we go together. Low pressure, low pressure and high pressure. And you'll notice even through making mistakes, we go over them and we realise that we've made a little mistake there. Okay. What I also get my class to do in terms of the assisting trade winds that they ask you about is we have a little acronym. So we use the acronym Never Eat Shredded Wheat Before PE. And these stand for your trade winds. So we've got the northeasterlies here as this first little blob. We've got the southwesterlies here as number 2, and we've got the polar easterlies here as number 3. And then I find, although that's taken me probably a minute or two because I'm talking through it, if you can learn a diagram similar to that, it takes about 30 seconds to draw and then you can actually go through it. And then as long as you always remember that you start at the equator, and you always talk about maximum heating from the sun causes warm air to rise. As the warm air rises, it cools, condenses, gives clouds and low pressure. So you've mentioned that first L, that low pressure that you've got there. At altitude, the air splits north and south. So we've got this northerly air going along here, like the little bit in our diagram. As it reaches 30 degrees north, it cools and it sinks. When it's sinking, it creates high pressure. Then at the surface of the earth, it splits into 2. Some will return as the northeast trade winds, completing the Hadley cell. Some will continue as the southwesterlies towards 60 degrees north. This is the bit that's sometimes a little bit trickier, but then you want to think what happens at 60 degrees north. My southwesterlies meet the polar easterlies at 60 degrees north. Now, they don't like each other. Okay, one is warm coming up from the south, one is cold coming down from the north. The warm air is forced to rise over the cold air and it creates our polar front and it brings us more low pressure there. Then at altitude, so height, the air splits, some returns south completing the ferrule cell, the rest returns north towards 90 degrees north where it sinks creating high pressure and completes your polar cell. Okay, now I know that is a bit of a mess and a bit of a scribble, but hopefully I do find that doing that diagram and going through it makes things a little bit easier. I will do a better one on my board and see if I can post it on Google Classrooms and things for you because that really is quite messy. But it's still, like I say, I think a really, really good way to go through it. Okay, next section we have is our ocean currents. And what I always say to people is the ocean currents can be a little bit tricky and can sometimes put people off. But I find that if you start with a wee intro paragraph, so something like this. So in the Atlantic, because we need to pick, but we do the Atlantic, we don't do the Pacific. Currents follow loops or gyres. Now, as soon as you mention the words loops and gyres, you get a mark. Clockwise in the northern Atlantic and anti-clockwise in the southern. That gives you a second mark. Even if you only put clockwise in the North Atlantic, you'll get a second mark there. Now, what's really important as well is they like you to be able to talk about where warm currents go and where cold currents go. So this wee second sentence talks about warm currents travel from the equator towards the poles, and cold currents return cool water from the poles. Now, a little intro paragraph like that will give you at least 3, if not 4 marks. So I always say to people, it's really, really good to start with that. And then what you want to do is you want to go into detail of the individual currents, and you want to make sure you include the name of the current, the direction in which it's travelling, why it is deflecting or why it travels in a certain direction, and then whether it's a hot or cold current. So for example, I would always start at the equator and I would say the equatorial current travels westerly. So there's my name and my direction. It is then deflected by the land masses of America. So there's the deflection and why. And this then continues in a loop as the North Atlantic drift, which is dragged by the prevailing winds. And that's moving warm air from the equator to the poles. And then the North Atlantic drift continues. Like I've said, the prevailing wind is what carries it. It then again is deflected by the land masses of Europe. Some returns as the Canaries current, completing the loop or gyre, whereas some continues as the North Atlantic drift. So you can see you don't need lots of detail of your loop. That's your northern loop. You can then do the same as the southern loop, because you're getting a lot of marks if you do that wee intro paragraph. The next bit, an actual final one, is our characteristics of our ITCZ, or this is part A. You would get 2 parts for this. So your 2 air masses that you've got are your maritime tropical and your continental tropical. Now, these are an absolute gift of a question if they come up. It's 6 marks worth and you get 3 marks for each. Now, I say it's a gift of a question. There's a few little key things that you need to remember. So you have to give the origins of both to get 6 marks. But then once you've done that, you can then pick any 2 from either of the list. And it doesn't need to be detailed sentences for this one, which is why I'm saying it's a bit of a gift of a question. So you can say the maritime tropical comes from the Gulf of Guinea, tick 1 mark. It is low pressure, tick 2 marks. It is hot or has very warm temperatures, 3 marks. Then the continental tropical comes from the Sahara Desert. There's your 4th mark. It is high pressure, 5th mark, and you get extremely hot temperatures, 6 marks. So it's actually quite a straightforward one. Now, one of the key things I'm saying with it being straightforward is there needs to be a difference. So for example, low pressure and high pressure is okay, but if you're doing temperature, you can't say they're both hot because it's too similar. So you'd need to say one is hot, one is extremely hot, or one is very warm and one is hot. So just be aware of the wee bits there. But I always say to people, have your origins and then pick any other 2 characteristics of both of them to learn. Gift of a question. Then the final ITCZ part, which is trickier, and there's 2 parts to this. So you have to describe the rainfall patterns, which I'm going to go through first here. Then you have to explain them. Now, the describe bit is the trickier bit because it can change. And like I said in that opening bit, it depends on the maps and the locations that you get. So for here, you've got Abidjan, which is on the coast. Then as you travel north, you go to Bamako and then you go to Timbuktu. And you can see the graphs at the bottom for the bars. And also, if you look on the map, there are these numbers with like 2,000, 1,500, 1,250. These are ISO Hayats, so lines of equal rainfall. So that's showing the annual as well as on the graphs there. So there's a lot of information to give you. Now, although the locations might change, so you might get Lagos instead of Abidjan, they will always have patterns. And there's 3 patterns you look to describe. So you want to talk about how the rainfall total decreases as you travel north. So for example, in Abidjan, the total rainfall is 1,545 millimetres, whereas as you travel to Bamako, it's 935, and then even further north to Timbuktu, it's 161 millimetres. Second of all, you then want to look for the dry months, and that will increase as you go north. So for example, in Abidjan, it rains all year round. In Bamako, there is no rain from November to February, and as you travel even further north in Timbuktu, there is no rain from November to April. And then finally, you want to talk about the double peak in the south and the single as you travel north. So for example, in Abidjan, there are 2 peaks of rainfall in July and October, whereas as you travel north in Bamako and Timbuktu, there's only 1 in the month of August. And you can give the numbers for these as well. Now, the key thing, and hopefully I've said it in my examples, but is they like comparator words and the 2 numbers. So a bit like I did, Abidjan has got the highest amount of rainfall, 1,445 millimetres, and then that decreases and you give the 2 numbers there. They always want a comparator and the 2 numbers to get a mark for describe. And like I say, that's the bit that can change because you might get slightly different graphs, but you'll always get the same 3 patterns. Now, in terms of the explanation, that's a little bit more, you kind of just need to learn it. Okay, so there's key things you want to mention. So the ITCZ is the Intertropical Convergence Zone. You'll get a mark for that. It is an area where 2 air masses meet, bringing low pressure. Again, you'll get a mark for that. Cities in the south receive the most rain as they're always under the influence of the tropical maritime air mass. Again, it will give you a mark. Cities in the north are largely affected by the tropical continental air mass, so that's why they get drier weather and lower rainfall patterns or numbers. And then finally, the twin peaks in the south and single peak in the north are to do with the movement of the ITCZ north in the summer and south in the winter. Now, obviously, that's been a bit of a whirlwind through atmosphere, but hopefully it helps. Hi, folks. This section is some revision on population. So, firstly, the possible questions that can come up for our population topics. So, firstly is discuss the different methods countries use to collect population data. Secondly, explain why it may be difficult to gather accurate population data in developing countries. 3 is your population pyramid, so discuss the possible consequences of these, and there are 2 different styles that can come up, so we'll go through both. And that's your economically less developed and economically more developed country. And then finally, you've got your migration. So referring to a migration flow you have studied, explain the reasons for this migration. So that's your push-pull factors. And then again, for a named migration flow you have studied, discuss the impacts on either the donor or receiving country. And we'll go over that as well. So firstly, your methods of data gathering. Now, there are 4 key things that you want to mention. I say 4, it might actually be 5. Yes, it's 5. So the first one is your census. Now, you're only going to get a maximum of 2 marks for census. So it's good, but don't go on and on and on about the census. So for example, you will get a mark if you talk about how a census is a gathering of data on a country's population, which is carried out every 10 years. As long as you've got the fact that it's gathering something in every 10 years, that'll give you a mark. And then you can get a further mark if you talk about some examples of what it gathers. So for example, it might gather data on population numbers, education, healthcare, and it's a snapshot over a week. The second one are your civil registrations. Now, in order to get the mark here, you need to say civil registrations, which include birth and deaths. So you need to talk about the registrations of births and deaths and how this is good because it's a continuous count of the population. And that's actually better than a census because it's continual. The second one is border control. So again, here you need to mention visa applications, which allows the country to see people who are moving into the country and also moving out. So again, it's keeping a continual look on that. Next, we have our Scottish Household Survey. So this is done continuously, and I think that's a key thing. It's like a mini census, but it's done continually to a random sample of the population. And they like the words continually because, again, it shows that it's better than a census, but they also like the fact that people are chosen at random when they're selected to do this. And then finally, you've got your NHS records who can, keep up-to-date information on healthcare and any health needs and things like that. So it's generally a 6 marker. So I always say to people, a couple of marks for your census and then a wee mark from each of the other ones that you've got there. Now, problems with taking a census. One of the key things here is it's generally quite a large question, so it's like 10, 12 marks, but you will generally get 2 marks for named examples. So you can see here, I've just sort of summarised the things that you want to talk about, but then I've put the named examples in to show you as well. So I would at least learn 2 of these. Doing 3 would be even better, just in case for some reason there's a third named example mark. So obviously they're all here, so you'd want to talk about how some people are nomadic, so they move around, so they might either not get counted, or they might be counted twice. That's really important that you say that they're not counted or they might be counted twice. They want you to think of the kind of practicalities of giving it out and filling it in. And obviously Mali's the example there. Literacy rates in some countries, they cannot read and write. So if they get a form, they're just physically not able to fill it in. So that's the kind of thing they're looking for. And again, South Africa's your example there. Size and access are quite similar. So I always encourage people to just do one or the other. And the tricky thing about size is a lot of people will say when a country's really large, it takes a lot of time and costs a lot of money to give the census. And very often people give Russia as an example, but we're technically looking for economically less developed countries. So I always encourage people to look at countries which are difficult to access, so mountainous countries like Nepal that I've put there, or you might talk about a country with large areas of desert or something like that, and how it's difficult to cross these countries, and it might be difficult in the actual delivering of the census. Conflict, Afghanistan is your best example. Again, I think a few people have been tempted to maybe talk about more recent conflicts and maybe pulling in Ukraine, but it's not an economically less developed country, so you won't get the named example mark for that. And again, for this one, you want to be specific about things like, it's too dangerous for enumerators to deliver the census, or the data goes out quickly because of the high death rates, or it's not representative because there's a lot more men and the women and children have maybe moved somewhere temporarily as refugees. Truth telling is there as well. Some people might be scared. They don't know why the government wants the data, so they might not actually tell the truth, so it's not valid. And obviously I've put China as an example there. There's one that I've actually not put on this list, which is multiple languages. So you get some countries where it costs a lot of money because they have to put it in many different languages and they can't do that. And I think actually when I was going through that list, I missed Ethiopia there. Some countries just cannot afford the census because it's just too expensive to be able to first of all deliver it and then to process it all and get some results from it. So there's a lot of information from that one, which is good. And again, remember your named examples for that. Population pyramids. Now the key thing is when this question comes up, or if this question comes up, you're only going to get one population pyramid. Now it should be quite straightforward, but you need to make sure you're recognising the correct one. So the first one I've got here is Uganda on the left hand side, so that's your economically less developed country, and the challenges with that country is that you have a rapidly growing population, in particular because of this high birth rate and because the death rate is falling in the country, so people are living longer as well. The second one on the right is obviously for ourselves, for the United Kingdom, but recognising the shape, the biggest challenge that they're going to have in the future is this ageing population, with our life expectancy increasing and many people living beyond the ages of 65, and in particular into the sort of 85 to 90 bracket there. So if we take one at a time, there's a lot of information on these. I'm probably not going to read through all of them in detail, but for your less economically developed country, you want to think about, maternity hospitals, immunisation programmes. There'll need to be money put into all these sorts of things. They might need to build more schools, train more teachers. All of these things will cost the government money. The government might put in policies to try and promote smaller families because they realise the struggles that's going to happen. So you might get policies like, for example, China's one-child policy or something similar. Kerala in India's got really good examples of how they're trying to control population sizes there. Housing's an issue. In many developing countries, it's already overcrowded, and that's just going to get worse. A lot of more people will be forced to live in shanty towns, so therefore obviously there's the challenges that come with living there. A bonus though, however, because although we talk about consequences, there can be good things. There's a much larger potential workforce as these babies and children grow older, so that may attract multinational companies to the country. However, a kind of downside to more workforce is because there's more of them, there might actually be high levels of unemployment or people being underemployed. So doing a job that they're not like doesn't match their skill set, so they are overskilled for the job that they do. So that's important if you recognise that population pyramid, that it's the rapidly growing we talk about. The second one is obviously like a country like ourselves, a more economically developed country where you have the life expectancy, which is increasing, and we have this ageing population. So it's more of this barrel shape. Now, sorry, these don't seem to fly in. Key thing is pensions to start off with. Okay, so that's going to cost the government more to pay people's pensions, and actual current workers, so working age people and working age people in the future, will actually have to pay more towards tax contributions in order to fill these pension money pot that's needed. Because of that, a lot of people living in the country will be encouraged to invest in private healthcare or private pensions because they know that the government might struggle and they might not get as much as they possibly could or would want or would need to live on. Certainly to live the lifestyle we're kind of used to. Obviously, there's going to be increased strain on the health service. Things like hip replacements, heart medication, these will all give you good marks. Retirement age might need to be increased, and it has actually already happened in a lot of countries, ourselves included. As well as health service, other services, so care homes, meals on wheels, these kind of things. Also more demands on adult children to look after the elderly parents, parents that are living for a lot longer. We might also need to encourage migration into the country, so in migration, in order to fill some job vacancies and to try and help meet the needs of everybody. And actually the birth rate falling might actually lead to a decrease in the demand for a lot of our young children services, such as schools and like maternity wards and things like that. And there could be, if we don't have the birth rate to provide a working population, we might actually have an increase in robots doing the jobs that people used to be able to do. Okay, and finally for migration, one of the key things is you must name your case study, and every single past paper question that we have allows you to choose. So I'm not saying only focus on one case study, but they generally always say for a migration you have studied, so you can pick. So you would do either Poland to the UK or Syria to Europe. Now they talk about in the question, give reasons for this migration, and that's the push-pull factors. Now, generally, these are quite straightforward, but the key kind of thing I wanted to point out to you is that they want specific reasons, so like hard facts and hard numbers. So the wee example I've put there is for Poland to the UK. The GDP in Poland was 12,700 per head compared to the UK's, which is obviously 30,900, so it's much higher. So if you move to Poland, you're more likely to have a job that pays better, to give you a better standard of living and things like that. They like that more than they move to get jobs. They like it to be a lot more detailed. So for Syria, you can obviously talk about the impact of the civil war and the fact that President Assad wasn't helping people enough, and the civil war broke out. You know, they like real specifics for that one. And then finally, your other migration question would be impacts on either donor or receiving. Now, sometimes they ask both, sometimes they ask one or the other. So the key thing is be careful as to whether it's the donor, and that's the country that the migrant is leaving, so they're moving from. So that'll be either Poland or Syria. So it's the impact on them, like the loss of generally the active population and the workers. You know, if it's Poland or for Syria, it's generally a loss of the women and children, because they've moved to stay safe, and the males are left at home to fight. You know, it's all these sorts of things. You get a brain drain left in the country. Whereas the receiving is the country that the migrant is moving to, so is receiving that person, so i.e. Scotland or Europe. So that would be either the benefits or the challenges that brings to the receiving country. Hi folks, in this session I just want to go over some skills and hints and tips for your mapping skills question. So first of all, it's always question 5, although might not be in your FAB because it's slightly numbered slightly different, but in the final exam it will be question 5. There is always part A and part B, but they are the same. The challenge is that you need to set the scene, so there's always something different that they're going to build. So for example, in 2023, it was a new housing development. In 2022, it was a new Eden project in Morecambe. So what you need to be very careful about is that you read the paragraph which sets the scene. It's always in a little text box at the top. Then part A always wants you to talk about the suitability or the advantages and disadvantages, which is just the same, of the proposed site or location. So sometimes they word it slightly differently, but they basically want you to go through what's good and what's bad about where they're going to build it. And they've already decided it is a real thing, it's not something they've made up. And then part B are the possible social, economic and environmental impacts this development may have on the surrounding area. And that is advantages and disadvantages, good and bad for the impacts as well. Now, both A and B are out of 20 altogether. So in theory, you can answer A and B together, or you can do it separately. I find separately is easier. Certainly for me, and my hints and tips will have it separate, but that's not to say you have to do it separately. You have to do A and B, and you physically can't do just one and get full marks. But you need to have A and B, and the 20 marks are fluid throughout. Now, for part A, first of all, the key tips for this advantages, disadvantages, good, bad of why the area that they've picked. Now, the key thing is there are 4 marks out of the 20 that are available for map evidence. Now, these are silly marks to throw away. You have to make sure you are definitely getting these 4 marks. Now, for the map evidence, there's a few different ways you can get it. You can either give grid references. Now, we are at higher level, so we're looking for 6-figure grid references. I'm not going to go through them here. If you're not sure, make sure you go and see your geography teacher and they will go through your 6-figure grid referencing with you. Second of all, you can use road numbers. So on every single map, the road numbers are written next to the map. So the M8 or the A623 or something like that. You can also use heights. So you could talk about the land, so using the contours, so you can say it's flat or it's low or any of that sorts of things, and you could give a number, so 10 metres. And then finally, you could use place names as well. I tend to encourage people to use this if they're talking about a small town nearby, say Wensleydale or something like that. They can pop that information there. Okay, now, like I say, it's 4 marks. You do not want to lose it. Grid references are the most common way. So I always say to people, just everything you write, the site is good because of this, or this is a good thing, or this is an advantage, because there is. Always just give a grid reference to back it up. Okay. Now, what I always try and do is try and get people to go through a kind of list of things that they want to think about. Now, it's obviously a challenge because you get a different scenario every time from what they're building, but we created with my class last year an acronym to try and help think about the different things that they're looking for. So the acronym it goes for LUDWAC, okay, so it's not a word, but we made it up, and here we've got each of the different parts. So the first thing you want to think about is the land, and is it flat land? Now, because it's a real development, it will be flat land, and flat land is actually a great way to get 3 marks, and I'll show you on the next slide how you do that. Then the second one, you want to think of the uses of the land. In particular, the last 2 years, so 2022 and 2023, they have given you land which has been used before. So for Morecambe, it used to be like a theatre or a swimming pool or something before. And for the housing estate this year, it was a disused airfield. Now, these are really good because the land's already level, the land's already flat. It's already got levels of electricity, plumbing, sewage, all these sorts of things. So that's a good thing that you can talk about. However, you could also say it's a negative thing because there might be some clearing up of anything left behind that needs to be done, or it might not be the right shape or the right size. So it's actually a really, really, really good thing. Obviously, if the land has not been used, again, that's a great thing because you can just start from scratch and you can do whatever you want. The D is for drainage. So are there rivers nearby? Is the land marshy? What's the suitability of the site? You know, if you've got marshland, you're going to need to put in more investment and more cost to make sure that the area is stable. If there's a river nearby, are you going to have to check and make sure that it doesn't flood? It's these kind of things. Workers I think are a really good one. You're always going to need construction workers. So where are your workers going to come from during construction? Is there a little town or a village nearby? Great, name it, get your map evidence mark. But also, are you building something that's got long-term workers? Okay, so is it like the Eden Project, or is it a hotel and leisure centre? You're going to need people to work all year round. If it's a retail park or hotel and leisure centre, these things are brilliant. Where's your nearby school? Because you can get kids, you don't know if it's a high school, but you can make that assumption. High school, the teenagers can work at it in the evenings and weekends. It's a great way to look at it. Accessibility, so how are your people getting there? So there's your roads, there's your railways, that's where you can bring in your road numbers. Again, think about construction. Is it a main road? Is it a motorway? Well, that's going to be great for your construction vehicles because they're bigger, they're heavier, they need large roads to get there. Whereas then you might say, but my customers, my people that are going to use the site or going to work there, could also come via this railway. Okay, you don't want to constantly talk about roads because it's repeat marks, but if you can do some roads, some railways, maybe it's located by the beach, you might get tourists on the way past, all these kind of things. And then finally, I call it customers, but where are the people coming from that are going to use what you're building? So if it's your housing estate, where are your people that are going to buy the houses coming from? Where are your hotel, customers coming from? Where are your tourists coming from? So again, it depends on the area, but if it was, say for example, a tourist facility, where are your nearby campsites? Here, that's where your tourists are going to come from. Okay, all these sorts of things you want to have a wee think about. Now here's a wee example sentence, and in particular the flatland one. Flatland should be your first sentence. Okay, we are very lucky still. I don't know if they're going to change their mind at some point, but they literally give 1 mark for saying this site is suitable because there is flatland. Then there's your grid reference. That gives your map evidence mark. That's what the ME stands for. And then providing you say something along the lines of, this is good as it's easy to build on, keeps construction costs low, you're going to get a 3rd mark. Okay, so it's really, really, really important. Okay, but like I say, flatland is an amazing one for getting 3 marks. And you'll see that map evidence mark there. As long as you do 4 of them, you're going to bank your 4 map evidence marks, which is a great way to start because it's almost 25% of your marks for that one there. Okay, now for part B, social, economic and environmental impacts. Like I say, it can be positive or negative on the area. Again, it's tricky because it depends on what you're building and it's a skills question. But social, I always think jobs. People in the area are going to get jobs. Then if people get jobs, they have more money. Then people's mental health is generally happier. They can then spend that in the local area. However, you're going to have traffic congestion during construction. That can be a negative thing. People can be late for their work, all these sorts of things. But also, another positive, increased facilities for people to use. Is it something there that locals can use? They're going to be happy with that. Economic, think the money. People have got jobs, they spend it in local shops. The local shops then benefit, they get more money. They get the multiplier effect then, the government gets more money, the local authorities then get more money. They then spend it back in the area, benefiting the area greatly. Environmental, generally negative, but is there something being destroyed? Again, there might not be, but are you destroying animal habitats? Are you getting rid of forestry areas? Are you getting rid of farmland? The impact that that's going to have. Obviously, the impact of more traffic, more construction. You can link it to your greenhouse gases. You can link it to your climate emergency. You can also think of conflicts that might occur. So if it's a tourist site, you're then encouraging more tourists and how the locals might not get on with tourists. All these sorts of things can be thought about. Now, and there we go, that's the wee thing I talked about there with your conflicts. Now, the one thing is that as well as using the map, there are always extra bits of information given the question paper. So for example, graphs and for example, tables. You can also get 2 marks available for using these. You need to do something with them, but you can get marks for using these. So for example, it might show the tourist numbers. And if you can see tourist numbers will increase when this opens, because in 1990 there were 3,000, whereas in 2026 they're going to be 6,000, then you would get a mark for doing that. Or it might be population increase. Again, it will increase. So there's people that need the houses, that will buy the houses. It was this number previously, it now is that number. Or it could be traffic flow when we're talking about congestion there. increase traffic during construction. It's going to cause problems for the local people. You can give the numbers before build and after build. So these are really, really, really good things to also pick up your extra marks. Okay, here's a wee example sentence linked to that. So traffic will increase in the area as seen in graph whatever the number is, with the number of vehicles before construction was 600 and after it increased to 1,000. You'd get a mark for that. That's for using the other sources, not just the map. And that's on top of your map evidence marks. This will result in greater journey times for local people getting to work and shopping, and our remark there, possibly increasing incidence of road rage, our mark. This will also increase carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emissions, that should say adding to the greenhouse effect and the climate emergency. Okay, now the key thing about the mapping question that is skills based, it's your best to practice and to bring them in to get marks. But my kind of key things to remember is read the information you get at least twice in the paragraph and the different graphs and the sources. Always give your 4 bits of map evidence. Always use the other sources because there's another 2 marks available for them. And I try and say to people, put yourself in that developer's shoes. Imagine you are building it. What are you going to need of the piece of land? And then also imagine you were living there and what is the impact that that's going to have on you. Hi folks, just a final wee bit in order to get some extra help and preparation for your FABs. There's obviously Let's Achieve, which all your teachers have access to and you should as well. There's also the Larbert High School Geography website, which has got lots of useful model answers and information on there as well. Obviously there is the SQ website with the past paper questions, but if you go into Let's Achieve, it links you directly to there with the different sections, which is really good. And anything else, ask your teachers.